So welcome, friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, Reverend Jim Lawson, the civil rights leader and legend. First, let me ask everyone to make sure you're muted. And thank you, Anne, for helping me to mute people and keeping an eye on the flow of things here. And feel free, everybody, to write your questions for Reverend Lawson in the chat box. And maybe, Anne, you can help me with all of that. I'm hoping Reverend Lawson will speak for 45 minutes. He's saying 30 minutes.
I hope not.
Very welcome. You're very welcome to talk, Jim. And then I may ask him for a few questions, and we'll open it up to everybody. We have
good. Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah, we have a good hour and a half, and in a couple of days, Cassandra, my assistant, and welcome to you, Cassandra, who's here with us today. She will send everybody a recording of the Zoom session if you want to listen to it again. I want to give a very special welcome and a shout out to our dear friend Raj Mohan Gandhi, who's here with us today, who's been on the Zoom before. You're most welcome, Raj. I want to give a shout out to Mary King. I don't think her video is showing, but Mary is the director of the James Lawson Institute. And I hope you all will Google that and learn about it. And maybe, Mary, if you want to, by the end, say a few words about that. You're most welcome here, Mary. Thank you for being here. So, dear friends, let's begin with a little prayer, and then I'll introduce Reverend Lawson. So I invite us to take a moment of silence, and dear friends, just take a deep breath, and let's all center ourselves in the presence of the God of peace and love and total nonviolence, our beloved God who calls us together into the beloved community. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our circle and ask for whatever graces of love and peace and nonviolence we need for ourselves and for the whole world, for justice and peace for our poor world. Beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us right now and bless us as we reflect with our friend and teacher, Reverend Lawson, on your call to become your holy people of nonviolence, on the call to work for racial, social, economic, and climate justice, to work for the abolition of racism and poverty and war, and digging up fossil fuels and every form of systemic violence and systemic injustice, that we might follow the nonviolent Jesus and do our part to welcome your reign of universal love and universal justice and universal nonviolence, that we might be your beatitude people, your beloved sons and daughters, your holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So dear friends, I'm really excited to welcome back and introduce you to my friend, Reverend Jim Lawson. As some of you know, he was on our Zoom 1 year ago, and I pummeled him with questions about nonviolence, and it was fantastic. And then I typed it up, and the transcript is on from the Zoom 1 year ago on the Beatitude Center website, the transcript of our conversation. It's at beatitudecenter.org/blog. And I really encourage you to read it if you haven't read it. It was also published at wagingnonviolence.org. And it's also on my own website, johndeere.org, which, by the way, just got revamped for the first time in 20 years. And it's going to be published in this fantastic big new journal coming out in November from Father Richard Rohr and the Center for Action Contemplation. So if someone can mute yourselves, maybe Anne can look into that too. Everybody, I keep inviting you to mute yourselves if you haven't. It's going to be in Richard Rohr's theology journal called Oneing, a big special issue on nonviolence. And it's the lead feature in it, and it's really fantastic. And Richard is very sick, and I was talking to him last week, Jim, and he's just delighted with your contribution and the whole thing. Martin Luther King called Reverend Jim Lawson way back in the late 50s, quote, the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. And Jim Lawson is still that today. Just to remind you a little bit about Jim, Jim spent time in the 1950s in prison for resisting the Korean War. Then he moved to India, where he taught in the mid 1950s. It's an amazing journey he's had. Then he read about the Montgomery bus boycott, moved back to the States, met Dr. King at Oberlin. Dr. King invited Jim to get involved in the campaign in the South. Jim joined the staff of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and moved to Nashville, where he began his famous workshops on nonviolence and founded the sit-in movement there and taught many great heroes, including John Lewis, Diane Nash, our friends Bernard Lafayette. And John Lewis called Jim the architect of the nonviolent movement in America. Jim helped found the Freedom Rides in 1961, the Meredith March in 1966, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, served as the director of nonviolent education for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was working as a pastor of this Centenary Methodist Church in Memphis, where he played a major role in the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968, and invited Dr. King to Memphis. I'm telling you all that so everybody knows some of Jim's amazing historic life, but he's the real teacher of nonviolence in the world. In 1974, Jim moved to Los Angeles with his family, where he served for decades as the pastor of Holman Methodist Church. Jim is a Methodist pastor, and and he was there for 30 years and leading many campaigns against racism, but in particular for the unions and workers. And Jim also taught at Harvard and USC, UCLA, Claremont, and Vanderbilt. I met Jim in 1990 in jail. And then Jim was the chair of the board of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and hired me as the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Thank you for doing that, Jim. Jim, I'm not sure how old he is, 62, 63, but this year he published his first book. And I think I was telling you, Jim, as being a bossy person, as you well know, like back in 1990, when are you going to publish a book? Because I'm really into books. Revolutionary Nonviolence. So friends, I've been promoting your book, Jim, but I really urge you all to get this book if you haven't. More, I urge you to buy copies and give them to young people. There's no other book like it. It's everything I hoped it would be, Jim. It's a real manifesto of nonviolence. It covers Jim's life and history, but it's so forward-looking. It's about now. And he had great editors help him and marvelous people like Angela Davis and Brian Stevenson, who I've just met recently, are involved in the book. Marilyn Wright Edelman, our friend, says this is the essential collection. I hope you don't mind giving me giving you a plug, Jim. The essential collection of the visionary teachings of Jim Lawson that are more necessary today than ever before. And our friend Dolores Huerta wrote, this is really the first quintessential handbook and guide of nonviolence. We've really never had a book like this. So and I've gone through it twice now, Jim, and it's so dense. Every page has tons of material. So I really urge you to teach the book and use the book with your groups. And the last thing I'll say to welcome Jim is that Jim called me last week, when we were talking about the Zoom, and he said, which is such quintessential Jim Lawson, because in the book, he talks a lot about how he and Martin King in the last year of Dr. King's life were talking about the great question, Martin's question, which is Jim's question, where do we go from here? And Jim was asking me that last week. What do we do in this moment right now when millions and millions of white people believe that lies are the truth. And he was saying that's really the question that he was dealing with right now, and that we needed a national conversation on that. So I've been urging Jim to just talk to us about anything he wants from the book or about that critical question that he raised. And so, dear friends, if we were in a public hall, I'd ask you all to stand and give a rousing round of applause to our friend and teacher. But let's show our hands and welcome our friend and teacher, Reverend James Lawson Jr. Jim, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself now, which is hard for me to do, as you know, and welcome. You're very, very welcome here.
Well, dear John, thanks so much for having me again. And I'm delighted to be a part of this Beatitudes Zoom workshop conversation. And John Deere, of course, represents one of the very fine practitioners of nonviolence out of the Christian faith, although he's quite an interfaith man as well, which is so essential. And we've stayed in touch over the years, and I count him as my colleague and friend and brother. And I count him also as one of the faces in my community of struggle, my faith community, my work community, my non-violent community, because we have to have that kind of community, both visible and invisible, as we work to change our nation and to let nonviolence become a reality in our world. I want to begin at a beginning because the term nonviolence is bantered around as though it is a kind of a traditional English language conversation of putting a non in front of a major word to indicate the opposite. I want to begin there because Gandhi quite clearly proposed the word nonviolence back around 1909, 010, although I think I can now pinpoint it better than I used to be able to. Gandhi sought to invent a new concept when he used the word nonviolence. He used the word in South Africa between 1906, 1910, as he organized immigrant Indian peoples against the racism of the British and Boer empires. He confronted this racism apparently as a kind of surprise to him, though he grew up in the British Empire and in India. It shocked him. On his way to Pretoria by train in a first-class compartment, he was confronted by a white British traveler, and out of that encounter, he was thrown off the train at Maritzburg, dumped on the train platform in the wintertime in South Africa. He calls it the most creative moment of his life, but he was angry because he was told, among other things, that as an Indian, he could not travel in the first class compartment in the train going to Durban. And that he angrily refused to go to a car for Asians and Africans. And so he was thrown off the train. I'll repeat, he calls it his most creative night ever. My most creative experience. Anyway, Gandhi writes in a 1942 volume that was published in India in English, a volume called Nonviolence in War and Peace. He writes, I invented the term, it does not use the word invent, nonviolence, as my translation of the word ahimsa, an ancient Jainist term, a part of the religion of Hinduism as well, which traditionally had been was interpreted to English as do no harm, commit no wrong, do no harm. Gandhi uses that term, nonviolence, as the translation of ahimsa. He recognizes that this is going to be a difficult issue. So ahimsa, according to Gandhi, means nonviolence. Nonviolence means love as power permeating one's behavior and permeating one's action, and is a science for personal and social transformation. Gandhi insists that love is not neutral, love is powerful. So nonviolence is an effort to demonstrate the powers of love and compassion in life. Gandhi and later King, Martin Luther King Jr., both insist that this term nonviolence is the road of action and is a science, is a lifestyle. One can use it personally with unimaginable amounts of reading and history in the saints and movements across human history, and can translate it into how you correct a wrong. So ahimsa translates for Gandhi into nonviolence. The non Gandhi actually writes is not a negative. It is a positive term that describes love permeating political, social, personal activity. My own life's work has not primarily been in the field of resisting, fighting, transforming racism, segregation, Jim Crow law and practice. So that has been a critical part of it. Being Black, it's the first issue I met that put me at odds with my society, though I could not talk about it. But at age 4, I was confronted for the first time with a playmate in my desegregated neighborhood in Massillon, Ohio, with racist terms. I do not remember the terms he used on me. We were the same age. We went to the same school. We lived in the same block on the same Tremont Street in Massillon, where my father was pastor of the St. James AME Zion congregation. Yet this boy, who was a part of our 30 or 40 member play group of about a 5-block area with a railroad track on a hillside, a river, the Tuscarora River, the street itself, a creek that ran in the back of Tremont, between Tremont and another street, a block behind my house. So we played in the whole area. We went to the same school. He and I were the same class in elementary school. Started the same year. And yet he hauls off and uses this immoral language of racism on me. I couldn't have said any of that at age 4, obviously. I knew that what he said was an affront to me and an insult and fighting words in the word. Words that required my absolute resistance. So the term nonviolence, as used by Gandhi, is a translation of the term ahimsa, a Sanskrit Jainist term. And Gandhi, and Gandhi uses it in that way. So nonviolence does not come out of the struggle of and the work and the intellectualism of the English language. This is the point I want to make. It comes out of Gandhi's own struggle to resist the South Africa Boer British Empire and its racism and its inequality. And it's forcing him to live in a fashion in which he did not believe that he must resist. So if I can sum this up in a word, nonviolence is a term coined by Gandhi as a translation of the word ahimsa from ancient Jainism around 600 years before Jesus of Nazareth, and is Gandhi's translation of that ancient Sanskrit term. I don't know if this makes sense to you. I hope it does. So nonviolence is not out of the struggle of the English language. That's the point I want to make, first of all. Nonviolence is Gandhi's translation of the term ahimsa and represents a technical introduction of a new word for we English speakers. You will find much of that in this book, Nonviolence in Peace and War, Volume 1. I don't know if it's one of the volumes of the Indian government, but it was a volume I picked up in India in the early 1950s. It is a social science term. It ought to be classified as a social science term. It ought to be seen as an effort to change the way we think and behave in political struggles, economic struggles, justice struggles. It's a term that for me suggests a whole process in my own life and in your life. Perhaps one of the great sins of the human family is that we who know we must be connected through the powers of love and compassion and beauty and truth have largely deserted that essential necessity of human life, love, truth, compassion. So that when we're in a conflict, we want our anger to dominate. We use the language of domination and even hatred. And we surround the term sanctions, as in the United States foreign affairs, international policies, dogmas. We use the language, not of human understanding, human accepting of our humanity and the humanity of all others, but we use language that divides and causes more of the conflict. Nonviolence is the attempt to not desert our love of life, not to abandon the fact that we were birthed in love. We were birthed of a loving God. Not to desert that and abandon it when things get tough, in crisis, conflict, wars, but rather to use our energy not in the Ukraine wars types of political struggles, but in nonviolent struggles that are hard. And difficult and perplexing. So nonviolence represents an invention and contribution to the mind, to the heart, to the science of how you do politics, how you dismantle wrong and evil and create what Jesus would have called the kingdom of God in your own life and on earth. And the whole part of my own commitment has been on the uncovering of that, the gathering in of that understanding of nonviolence. So Gandhi, I see as the father of nonviolence in the 20th century. Perhaps the most important in intervention intellectually and spiritually of the 20th century. More important than the equations of general relativity that Albert Einstein introduced and wrestled with. It's helped to cause the scientific and technological revolutions of the 20th century. More important, because it's the intervention that can revolutionize nations and communities. And it's the kind of a description of what we human beings have tried to do our entire history. We have not, we have tried to build families. We know that families are critical for the advancement of our human species. Now, alongside that, we have, I'll repeat this in another way. Alongside that, we have too much thought that the bow and arrow could be used for war and killing each other. And that's led to our present war economies and to the war economy of the United States of America. So though we have been created as a massive movement of the love of God, we have abandoned that when the going gets rough and tough. Let me apply this more specifically now to Ukraine. Ukraine would be in a better position for victory today if, instead of following the path of war in defending against Russia, it were following the path of nonviolent resistance. I'm going to say that again. Ukraine would be in a stronger spiritual political position today against Russia if, instead of following the old ways of oppression and oppressive violence, it had declared an all-out campaign of nonviolence against the Russian invaders. It would be stronger in its resistance. It would be far more united in resistance. I will not say that it would be less suffering. One cannot predict all of that. But the suffering would have a larger, powerful impact on the reshaping of the nation and allow the nation to become what it wants to become, which violence and war can never do. Dwight Eisenhower, our Allied commander-in-chief in Europe, and later our president in 52 to 60, Dwight Eisenhower has said, war is hell. Just like that. I haven't seen Eisenhower quoted in any of the public conversations over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. War is hell. You cannot create heaven out of hell. You simply create more hell, especially in the spiritual poisons that are often daunted the human family. And that is a critical issue in the United States. What Mel White, the founder of Soul Force in the LGBTQ struggles in the United States, Mel White called it spiritual poisons. The spiritual poisons that dominate our thinking and the way in which we act, which makes it far more difficult to act in terms of nonviolence. But Ukraine would be better off if the president and the parliament and the other political leaders had met Russian invasion with nonviolent resistance. Now, this actually did happen in my lifetime. When the Nazi forces, when Hitler's panzer divisions swept across Europe, and moved into Denmark in the late 30s, early 40s, but it was late 30s, I'm pretty sure. The Danish Parliament, and with the support of the King of Denmark, made a very practical decision. They decided that their military forces would be swept asunder by the German panzer divisions, and that they had, even with their military forces, they had no defense against the invasion by the Germans. So they did the unspeakable thing. The government surrendered to Germany and ordered its army and navy to surrender. This is the late 30s, perhaps the early 40s at the latest. King Christian of monarch of Denmark normally rode his horse through the streets of Copenhagen as a national political symbol before that invasion, but did it all through the war. And so became like Queen Elizabeth, a symbol of national unity, symbol of the unity of the language, the unity of the culture, the unity of the people, Danish. When the German orders went out that the Jews had to be picked up and shipped to Germany for utter death, the Danish people, not being organized even, nevertheless, out of their culture, out of their symbols of the king and their unity, saved every Jewish person they could find and knew about in Denmark. And later then used all sorts of fishing boats to take their Jewish population and several thousand people into Sweden and to safety. So Denmark as a people, as a nation, as a community, and as a country, saved almost all their Jewish people from the Holocaust of the Nazis. They got great criticism from this. This happened in some ways spontaneous out of the leadership of the king and the government, the parliament of Denmark. They experimented, though they did not call it that, with non-cooperation resistance of German occupation. And there were forms of violence of what kind of happened, but the Danish people came out more united than any single set of people in Europe out of World War II. And their lands, their buildings, their churches, their farms were largely not destroyed by war, as was the devastation of that war on almost all of the rest of Europe. So that's a historical illustration of, though it happened by accident, maybe not by accident, by the nature of the Danish culture, perhaps by a king and a parliament that was the government that knew that they were no match for the German fierce invasions, and said, let's surrender. It's the better option. Here in the United States, we do not know about that option. We cannot, we would call it a cowardly option, but it's in the history books as a country that said, in the case of a fierce invasion, our armies will surrender and will resist in ways other than violence. I wish that could be taught in the school systems of the United States, because the United States is the most violent culture known to the human race. United States of America, our country, we, the people of the USA, embody the most violent culture known in human history. We even compete with a German culture that in the 40s is killing maybe 26 million people, 6 million Jews in what we call the Holocaust now. But 20 million, 26 million people were killed in the Holocaust. Communists, Christians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a whole host of Christians, priests, Protestant pastors, underground resistors in France and elsewhere, who were picked up and slaughtered. 26 million, 6 million Jews. The Warsaw population and the Berlin population of Jewish people has never recovered. Denmark is a lone unknown historical illustration of where a political apparatus said, the Germans have invaded us. We will not fight them fire with fire. We will resist them with our culture as a people, with our songs, with our work, with our love for one another, with our protecting the weak, with our holding the best way we can together our cities, our rural areas. And we will not yield to the hatred and the violence of this invasion. It is an extraordinary story that the West has quickly pushed into the background in order that it can have a NATO organized to prevent Russia's aggressive behavior. NATO has been highly successful, has it not? There's no question about it in the United States. We finance it to billions of dollars. It was designed out of World War II for the purpose of stopping the Soviet Union's aggression and now Russia's aggression. It has failed any number of times. The Ukraine war is one of the great failures of NATO. But here we are in the United States, completely wedded to making NATO support the defense of Ukraine against the Russian forces as the only way that you can do the defense of a people. I will say to you, from the perspective of nonviolent study and struggle, NATO has failed, as has all the military pacts out of the Western world, the treaty organizations, in preventing war, because, and they failed to prevent aggression. economic aggression, cultural aggression. So nonviolence is Gandhi's invention to translate the term ahimsa and to get us, as he himself did, to pull out of our personal, social, political histories and people's histories the ways in which, through the powers of love and truth, we human beings survive in spite of our NATO alliances and our sensibility that violence is the power that most enables us to survive or to dominate or to bring about changes. My definition of violence is something else. Violence is the misuse of power on a personal basis, on the basis of a nation, on the basis of a police force. Violence is the misuse of power that through intimidation, domination, injury, or killing, or war, we seek to solve a conflict or conflicts and to win them at the defeat of the peoples we call the enemies, rather than the use of power to build the beloved communities of equality, liberty, justice, handling and dissolving conflicts in a way that strengthen our character and that resolves injustice and turns cruelty into community. Racism into sisterhood and brotherhood. Violence into the beloved community. Nonviolence is the power that puts at the beginning of the family our babies and children and young people. And they're being raised in a fashion that enables them to seize hold of the gift of life and to use that life to become alive. It's Augustine who wrote centuries ago that the glory of God is a human being, fully loving, fully alive. And that should be the goal, it seems to me, every single one of us, and of life itself. So again, nonviolence is Gandhi's intervention in the 20th century, translating the ancient religious principle of do no harm. And insisting that ahimsa, or nonviolence, is the only power that can enable us human beings to become fully alive and enable us to build families and villages and communities and rural crossroads and nations and peoples where we grab hold of a larger piece of the gift of creation and of the urgency and importance of the human species. And I would, like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, insist that nonviolent power is the power out of which comes life, and it is power out of which God's will on earth can become the model and the purpose of our human family. Well, John dear, I talked more than any 30 minutes. But I wanted to, however, just stress that this point, according to Gandhi's writings, nonviolence is not a word that grows out of the struggle of understanding English and creating English. Nonviolence is an invention by Gandhi. His translation of the term ahimsa. In that sense, we should spell nonviolence without the dash, but it's a single word. And we should insist that this nonviolence is the exception in the history of the English language, that it does not mean not violence, but it means ahimsa. Love as the power of creation and the powers that will allow the human race at its best to tap the potential that God has given us. And I would conclude by saying simply that the human species is the unique species that we know anything about. This should not be about arrogance or any superiority to life, but it should be about humility. But of the 50 billion or so guesstimations of the scientists of how many living species have existed on Earth, the human species is the only one that has learned to fly, to build buildings, to create cathedrals, to paint pictures, to love family and communities. Other species may have some signs of imitation, but none of them can compare. For as far as science knows, as far as we in the religious world know, as far as we in the political struggle know, the human species is the unique species in our galaxy or galaxies. Which means that when Jesus says, among other things, your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as in heaven. Jesus, as a massive teacher, is putting his finger on what I think to be the key for human life. That we become the species that exemplifies the will of God on earth as it is in heaven.
Amen.
A task that we cannot imagine. And a work that we can never realize, but which I have found to be the very joy of being alive, the strength of life. Well, I'll stop.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. That was so beautiful to hear you talking about nonviolence and how Ukraine could be doing nonviolence and we could be, and how they did it in Denmark. I wanted to ask you, and then I'll call on Raj and Mary if they wanted to ask you anything about the topic you had mentioned on the phone with me, about any suggestions you have about using nonviolence right now in this moment, in these years ahead that we're facing, it's such a strange time, as you put it, where lies are taught and believed as truth. But the election didn't happen, and the January 6th event, there's many ways we could talk about that. But I want to ask you just to reflect for a couple of minutes, not too long, on ways we can use and engage nonviolence at this moment as we go in the next year and two ahead. And you had mentioned on the phone, and in the book, you talk about several phrases. Maybe you want to use them as starting points. Gandhi's phrase, experimenting with truth. Well, if we're in a culture of lies in a deeper way than ever before in our culture, how might we experiment with truth? I think that's what Gandhi might call us. Second, I was moved in the book, you say, quite emphatically, begin where you are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And maybe reflect on that. And the third thing you also say emphatically in the book, you talk about your history of Methodism, one-on-one. You know, that there's power in one-on-one talking about nonviolence. And then lastly, the importance and the urgency of teaching nonviolence. Every one of us needs to be a teacher of nonviolence to everybody we meet from now on. So as a response to the culture of lies, maybe a few thoughts on that.
Yes. You go about it in the fashion that I thought about earlier last night and this morning again. Our nation is desperately in need of learning the language of democracy and justice and community building. And our political parties, our media, our plantation capitalism, all teach us to handle conflict by imitating the wrong that we abhor. Or human ancient literature insists that you cannot overcome evil with evil. And that means you cannot overcome evil using the language of evil or analyzing the issues as evil does it. And my suggestion to you is that the forces of spiritual wickedness in the United States, the forces of spiritual wickedness in the United States are very fierce. And in language and behavior, so much so that, as an example, when we in this last 6 weeks, when we've had a Uvalde and a Buffalo, we have no language by which we can handle it. We can only talk about grieving and empathizing with the victims and praying. But I would like to say to you that that praying that we called for as a nation with the Uvalde is a praying that is empty. It is not prayer. Prayer in the great traditions of the world's religions, especially Jesus, prayer is a tactic that we use to line ourselves up with the will of creation, with the will of God. It helps us to come to understand what God expects of us. So prayer that is not linked to the discovery of the will of creation is empty. It's nothing. So the national rituals over Uvalde is an emptiness, except on the part of some individuals across our country who I know pray genuinely as a public ritual. It's nothing because we are afraid of addressing the issues that have to be addressed. The issue is not guns, the issue is violence. We allow the guns to be available because we are committed to the notion that violence is the power that helps us dominate the earth. So the guns are permissible. We have to change our notion of what is required for dismantling and for building. I think it is a very serious issue that in the United States, 71 million people in 2020 voted for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a highly diseased human species. Highly diseased. He's not someone who operates out of not knowing his human nature. He's a human being, diseased. There's a thing, I'll quote a Western book. Donald Trump is a man with a hole, H-O-L-E, down the middle of his soul. Therefore, a diseased person unable to become the person God would have him be, creation would have him be. It's not just a question of human nature either. It's not just a question of it. It's a hole down the middle of his soul. Too many human beings allow the circumstances of their life to disease themselves, to scar their human species, which is a massive issue in the United States. So there are one of the major theses that I teach is that racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism produces a multiplicity, peculiar, weird, anti-human spiritual poison that allows people to grow with a hole down the middle of their soul and not to grow humanly. And racism, violence, sexism, plantation capitalism are the four great spiritual poisons that combined have diseased USA life and USA people. And we are often breathing in that spiritual poison rather than the fumes of love and beauty and truth. And that's why I urge Beatitude to carefully study the Black community. The Black community supports no leadership that calls for some kind of revenge for slavery or for Jim Crow law or for racism. We support no such leadership. Almost 100% of the leadership that we, the Black community, support today is a leadership that seeks dismantling of the wrong and making room for the space where all are created equal, where all are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every time in the midst of a community of Black people in the United States, there has been people who want revenge, who want to match racism with racism. We have rejected them. Martin King recognized this way back in 65, 66. This is one of God's blessings in the United States. We Black folk, in spite of slavery and racism, in spite of being shut out of so much of life, we still demand equality, liberty, justice for all. There is a spirit which I feel personally that seeks no revenge, that seeks a more quality community of life in my home, on my street, in my neighborhood, in my congregation, in my work. I am aware that my life was linked with Martin Luther King Jr. But since the 1980s, my life has been linked with a state senator in California by the name of Maria Elena Durazo. She is a senator in California. She was the president of Unite Here Local Union 11. And we systematically did workshops in the 80s and 90s for all of her people, a very small union, mostly Hispanic people now. And they consider themselves a nonviolent justice union. That's been this two pieces of work, so that Los Angeles has become a labor city with more than 800,000 working people in more than 200 unions. And most of those unions call themselves not business unions, but unions for the justice of all its members and their families. What hurts the union member hurts everyone. And the union therefore has to be on the side of we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's been a marvelous piece of work in my life. So I've had this great privilege of applying nonviolence to ending racism, Jim Crow law and practice, and to also ending economic cruelty and slavery. Both tasks, in my mind, are critical.
Thank you, Jim. Let me, because we have maybe 15 or 20 minutes left. Let me call on Raj if he has a question or comment, and then I'm going to ask Mary King after Raj. Go ahead, Raj. Let me unmute you, or Ian, if you can unmute. Oh, here he is. Great.
Am I heard?
Yeah, you're great. Go ahead.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to say that what an incredible scholar Reverend Jim Lawson is, because today's talk is the talk of a profound scholar and a careful scholar. Secondly, I want to say what an incredible teacher he is, because he's also, sometimes he addresses the same class, but he is fresh in his teaching. And he has taught in an absolutely new way. So that's my comment. So I absolutely love him and salute him for that. And I think that his point about Russia and Ukraine and the war there is a very important one. It's a crucial one today for the world. And I think all of us who love humanity, love equality, love liberty, love for people not to control one another, that to bring, to halt the war there is a very important goal for us. So I'm very glad that Reverend Lawson has pointed to that. And my question finally is this, which I've also raised before, and which is that both in the United States and in India and in some other parts of the world and in Russia, Putin's Russia, where the ideology that is being pushed is that some people have a greater right to rule a country than other people. That some people are meant to be at the top and others are meant to be at the bottom. That this is a very powerful force in the world today, and here in the United States, where lies are regarded as a fantastic building block for a new society. So using nonviolent struggle to dismantle this kind of regime of control and domination, whether in India or in the United States or in other parts of the world, is also our task. And any guidance that Reverend Lawson can give us on how to wage that fight, I would appreciate.
Thanks, Raj.
Well, John, I would say let's go to other questions and comments.
Okay, so I'll call on Mary and then I'll call on David. Welcome, Mary. You can unmute yourself, or Ann can unmute you, or I'm trying to, but I'm not good at that.
Now, can you hear me?
There you go. Yes,
Okay,
welcome.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm so glad that you chose to speak about the saving of the Jews in Denmark, Jim. I just think that that is such a powerful example. And of course, the king was there every day, riding his horse every morning. And he asked to have the yellow star to pinpoint Jews, an act of outrage and hostility against followers of the Judaic faith. But he wore the yellow star as he went amongst the people every day in the commercial areas, riding his horse, so that there was a top-down commitment to fighting Hitler without the use of violence. It's just an additional underlining of your marvelous choice of this example, because of course we've seen our share recently of leaders who do the opposite in a most profound way, and it's very disturbing. I just want to add that, but also the talk of what was used against Hitler reminds us that it used to be one of the great claims to be made against the use of nonviolent methods used to be, yes, but would it work against Hitler? I've heard this 1,000 times from students walking into my classroom and posing this question, who have no idea of how effective the use of nonviolent methods were against Hitler. And in fact, the first book that traces this in countries, all kinds of countries, Czechoslovakia and so on, all across Europe, didn't come out until about 15 or 20 years ago. It was not an important research item. So we have in our own way to put more attention and documenting what you brought us in a very clear view today. And I would also say that in addition to your points about the United States, the fact that we do not teach this method in US public schools is a source of almost dementia. We don't teach the historical examples that are broad, wide, numerous of the success of nonviolent approaches. So for example, the use of child labor was eliminated in 1903 when an Irish immigrant social worker moving from Ireland to the United States led 300 child laborers on a 300-mile walk from Philadelphia to President Theodore Roosevelt's summer residence. Some of them had limbs and fingers missing from industrial accidents. And they never got to meet with President Roosevelt. He refused to see them. But along the way, the news media went crazy with the example of the 300 children being led by this Irish social worker who called herself Mother Jones. And the news media expansion of the awareness of child labor led to its outlawing very, very rapidly. So we don't even have to organize movements in order to get rid of certain injustices. Just being clever in the way that we plan and use nonviolent action can be very effective. However, this is not being taught in our public schools. That's my point. We are not taking the opportunity. I remember learning about the War of Independence about the age of 5 or 6. And then I heard nothing more about the means that are available throughout our society. High school teachers don't send students into the community to document successful examples of nonviolent action. So I'm profoundly grateful for your presentation today, Jim, because it's a very potent reminder that we are not even availing ourselves of some of the most important ways of spreading the word on what you've shared with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I'm hoping everybody that Mary's going to lead us in a Zoom in the spring on Kingian nonviolence. Let's hear from David Hartso, and then we'll go back to you, Jim. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Jim, for your powerful presentation today. I'd like to ask you your any further thoughts you have about what massive nonviolent resistance in Ukraine to the Russian invasion might look like. Because I think the people of the United States, our government leaders certainly, and the people of Ukraine, the people of all the NATO nations need to see there is a viable alternative to, to more and more killing, more and more arms, threatening nuclear war, et cetera, as a way to try to resist this Russian aggression. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Jim. Do you want to respond to any of the comments?
Well, I'm not sure how much time we have left, John, but again,
You got about 5 or 10 minutes.
well, I agree with both Mary and David that we in the United States do not look at our own history, where again and again we've gotten better results from strikes and picket lines in front of the White House and civil disobedience with a Eugene Debs and a Martin King going to jail, we've gotten better results from those campaigns than we have gotten from our wars. We've gotten more dollars for a buck from the nonviolent movements in the United States than we've gotten from the building of a tank. And that part of American life has really not been studied, as David has indicated. In the 20th century, the Rosa Parks King movement of nonviolence, what John Lewis called the nonviolent movement of America, began the public desegregation of the whole nation. I have yet to see a major document on that movement that points how signs over drinking fountains, white only, colored only, waiting rooms, all those signs came down. It was massively so in the Southeast and South Central, but in Los Angeles, Black people knew they could not go into the Bullock's tea room and sit down and have a cup of tea. Mexicans knew they could not go in there and get served. In Glendale, there were 2 signs on the city limits. No Jew. Also the sign, no Negro should allow the sun to set on him in Glendale. This is true also at San Clemente. There's now a major document on the sunset cities around the United States. Well, what is unknown is that the movement of the 60s, movement that I timeline, 1953 to 1973, 20 years of struggle in which those signs not only came down, but the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 declared such signs unconstitutional. And a doctor or a drugstore or a grocery store could not have such signs. They were unconstitutional. So it both in the spirit of the movement, they began to come down. The Civil Rights Bill of 64 makes it illegal for any private person to put up a sign that says no WAP allowed. The politics of our country tends to celebrate primarily the Voting Rights Bill of 1965. But the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 is even more important for how our nation has changed. And the third thing I might say about this is that the Federalist Society, which is a racist organization, the Federalist Society was organized to enable a Supreme Court and a federal judiciary to say that by religion, religious consciousness, you could discriminate, which is precisely what our Supreme Court has been doing for the last 20 years. That a religious conscience allows you to mistreat a fellow USA person.
Well, as we begin to wrap up, Jim, I wonder if you had any last closing word you wanted to send us off with, encouraging us to go forth in the spirit of nonviolence and do our bit.
Well, I just a very brief word. Finally, I would like to say that, of course, we as persons must adapt the powers of love to living and to our own lifestyle and to the work we do. That's number one. And we can do this person to person within our families and otherwise. But the second thing I think we have to do, that in the organizations to which we belong, and I suspect that all of us belong to a variety of organizations that want life to move in the direction of truth and justice, is to suggest in our organizations that we adopt a nonviolent stance and lifestyle, and then that we seek to create small campaigns and large campaigns that can dismantle the wrong and help us to have more space for truth and justice and equality to emerge. In some ways, our country's history has limited the emergence of justice and truth. And by our creating small movements and large movements, campaigns that follow Gandhi and King and Jesus, we help to transform ourselves and our land.
Mm-hmm.
Gandhi suggests in this book that I mentioned, Nonviolence in Peace and War, suggests that when wrestling with nonviolent struggle, we are wrestling with the very power of creation. The force more powerful for us. And in that wrestling match, it's rather marvelous what can be accomplished.
Amen. That might be a beautiful note to wrap it up on. I want to make a few announcements, Jim, and I'm wondering if after I do, you'd be willing to give us a final blessing. You don't have to if you don't want to. Just to invite, first of all, let's a big round of applause for all this powerful, deep sharing from our friend and brother and teacher. Thank you so much, Jim, for so much shared about your life and the wisdom of nonviolence. There's so many powerful things you said and sense. So we're all really, really grateful. And thank you. I invite everybody to, again, please get Jim's book, Revolutionary Nonviolence. Please give it away as gifts, especially to young people, to do what Jim and others were talking about, to pass on the message. It really is a summation of everything Jim has done with his life. And it's a great, great book, I think. I am happy to announce that Cornell West is going to do a Zoom with us in the spring. I asked him to do a talk. He said, no, I need to have a conversation with you on nonviolence and Jesus. So please mark your calendars. I posted maybe 7 or 8 new Zooms on the beatitudecenter.org website. But 2 weeks from now, my friend Carolyn Whitney Brown will talk about her new book about our friend Henry Nouwen. And then we're going to have a Zoom about Catholic social teaching with the leading Catholic historian in the United States, David O'Brien. Then our young friend Kazu Haga, who wrote a brilliant book on nonviolence, is going to do a Zoom on October 5th, unpacking Dr. King's 6 Principles of Nonviolence. He was a student of yours, Jim, at the James Lawson Institute, run by our friend Mary King. I'm hoping Mary King's going to do a Zoom with us next spring as well. In November 12th, Dorothy Day's granddaughter, Martha Hennessy, is going to do a Zoom about Dorothy Day and nonviolence and her various angles on nonviolence. And then on December 3rd, Maria Stephan, who's the colleague of Erica Chenoweth, who wrote the most important book on the history of nonviolent resistance, it's really marvelous. Maria is going to give us a Zoom on the movements of international nonviolent resistance today, including Ukraine. And she and Erica are the world's leading scholars on this. So it's a marvelous lineup. I'm going to do a little retreat at Christmas if you're interested in that. So again, lots of wonderful things, many others coming up next year. Jim, thank you for being here. If you don't feel like giving a little blessing, I can give one, but would you like to give us a little closing final blessing?
Go ahead, John. I'll be pleased to have your blessing.
Well, everybody, let's bow our heads and may the God of peace and love and nonviolence, who created us to follow Jesus in the fullness of love and peace and nonviolence, send us forth under the wisdom of Jim Lawson, that we might do our part, not only to dismantle violence in our own hearts and lives, and the structures of racism and sexism and war and plantation capitalism, and even nuclear weapons and the destroying of creation, but send us forth to be instruments of God's peace, that we might teach and speak and proclaim the way of nonviolence every day, far and wide, to all those we meet, as Jim has done for the rest of our lives, that we could do our part to welcome God's reign, the beloved community of nonviolence here on earth. So may the God of universal love and peace bless each one of us. In Jesus' name, I bless you. Go forth, be at peace in the spirit of Jim Lawson. Thanks, Jim. Have a great weekend, everybody. You can watch this again and the old Zoom on YouTube and on the recording link coming out this week. We send you forth, and great gratitude, Jim, for sharing your time and wisdom with us. And be well, everybody. Have a great weekend. Go forth and be nonviolent as Jim has instructed. Okay, I'll sign us off now. Thanks so much for being here. Bye, Jim. And thanks, everybody. God bless you all.